Have you ever wondered what it really takes to build an amazing team as a business leader? Well, we have someone here who knows how to do that, not just with knowing people intuitively, but also using quantitative measurements and understanding some things that help categorize people in certain ways. So if you want to learn more about that, stick around. This is going to be a great conversation. Welcome to the channel. My name is Tom. I'm the founder of Vertical Motion, where we help good people become great leaders. And we do that by helping mid-career professionals move to the executive level. If that's interesting to you, there's a link down in the description to learn more about that. Today, I am really excited. I get to talk with one of my favorite people. He's a really good friend of mine, someone I admire and look up to. He's done a lot of great things for this country and for veterans and for entrepreneurs and for small businesses. And so please help me welcome to the channel, Mr. Dean Bundschu. Dean, good to see you. How are you, my friend?
It's great to be here as always, Tom.
Tell the audience a little bit about yourself, because you have an amazing career, and I'd love for you to just kind of go all the way back to the Army days.
The Army days, right? Yeah, so me and you met through the military entrepreneur community, and I was fortunate enough to serve as an infantry officer back in the day. Served as a company commander of a unit during OIF 1 back in 2003, 2004. And like a lot of veterans on the backside of that, decided to transition out of the military. And I'd start there because I feel pretty fortunate that I connected with Orion International. A lot of folks might be familiar with them. You know, they help veterans transition from the military to the corporate world. Well, it so happened that when I came up to Raleigh from Fort Bragg, they sat me down, did some interview prep, resume prep, but they had me take a quick 10-minute survey, right? And lo and behold, I don't know, 10 minutes later, offered me a job to come work for them. And that's because I essentially had the ideal pattern for account management role. Naturally, had no experience in sales, no background in sales, having just transitioned out of the military, but they knew I was wired to do that just because of my inherent traits. And, you know, both the founders were veterans. I say that because they not only, you know, set me up for success in the sales world, and I became one of their top guys pretty quick, but they both knew that I was built to be an entrepreneur. And, you know, with someone like me, finding my win-win is how you motivate me. And when you find that and help me obtain my goals, then I help you obtain your goals. I stayed there for a couple of years, but I did end up transitioning, and both founders helped me to becoming a CEO of my own company, a company called Prep Champs. It was in the high school recruiting space, multimedia company, technology company, but built that company with two other veterans, hired a bunch of veterans, raised some venture capital, and of course, not wanting to reinvent the wheel, used all the systems process that, you know, Randy and Bill put in place at Orion to build and scale their company. One of the tools, of course, being Culture Index. So put all the right people, right seats, was fortunate enough to sell it. And I really was taken in by that experience. And I wanted to show other veterans what was possible and maybe guide them down the same path that, you know, Randy and Bill guide me. So as you know, founded Bunker Labs with a couple other veterans to help veterans and military spouses become entrepreneurs. And naturally, we use the tool again. And it's a big reason why we went from a couple little non-funded chapters to 40-some chapters all across the country, ended up helping, as you know, really tens of thousands of veteran entrepreneurs and military spouses. And while I was there, really learned the tool inside and out, you know, decided to start helping some of the high-growth veteran-run companies in the community. Really enjoyed it. So shifted out of there and now do this. And, you know, I'm fortunate to work with over 40-some companies of all shapes and sizes, of which a vast majority are veteran run. So my two biggest loves are the veteran community and entrepreneurship. And as you can see throughout my life, I've managed to marry those two. And just
there's a weave between the two.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I work with a couple civilian run companies too, but naturally just with that, you know, the connections I built through that nonprofit have been very beneficial.
It's amazing to me, like that, just talking about your getting hired out of the military story, that they, in a 30-minute interview and a 10-minute assessment,
Right.
they knew enough about you from that to make a decision to bring on someone who has no experience, no qualifications other than what they see in your core personality. It's really like kind of mind-blowing to me. And this is why I lean so heavily into learning from you about this. So I'd love for you to just kind of maybe talk a little bit about what's going on here. What is the science behind what you're doing with a 10-minute assessment?
Yeah, as far as the analytics go, I always tell people when you look at all the analytics out there, whether it's DISC, strength finders, predictive index, culture index, there's a lot of overlap with the analytics. You know what I mean? But I mean, we would say that our analytics is the most accurate. A lot of those are going to be pretty close if you put them side by side. But when you look at inherently how the survey structure and how it was built, the data behind it's just incredible. And the PhDs, that we have that are constantly in there refining the analytics are second to none. And the insights they provide are just fascinating and incredible. And when you look at the individual traits, that we measure, the 7 work-related traits, which I'm sure we'll touch upon, the accuracy per trait's about 93.7% validity. So the bottom line is, even if one of them is slightly off, 6 of them are going to be pretty locked in. And doing this for as long as I have, I very rarely have anyone push back against who they are. And furthermore, I tell people, like, why would you lie about who you are? I mean, the purpose behind the analytics is so that we understand the individual. We understand what your strengths are. We understand how to motivate, communicate, create an environment for you to be successful. In other words, get you in the right seat, right? So, and if you weren't honest while you were taking the test, first of all, we have some triggers to kind of catch that for the most part. But the bottom line is, if you do try to game the system, you're only hurting yourself, because you're going to get stuck in the wrong seat, and the likelihood of you succeeding is not going to be good, and no one's going to win. So bottom line, it's just been a powerful tool for me in all facets of my life. And I always say what I love doing the most is helping people sometimes like really understand how to focus on their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. Because if you get in that zone of genius, your life changes. And really, that's why I do this.
I'll take me as an example. I remember when you first gave me the assessment, spring of 2023. So I was just starting into thinking about doing coaching. I wasn't even doing it full time yet. You sent me the assessment and I took it, and it said that I was a daredevil.
Yes.
And you said, you're the kind of guy who likes to jump off a hill and build the plane on the way down before it, hopefully getting it flying before it hits the ground. And that you leap before you look, you have, you're aggressive, you're able to move forward. All of that came from this assessment, and it's dead on. And actually, it's been great to not only understand myself, but understand the people I work with, to understand my wife, for example. So she's a very different personality. She's a craftsman, and her personality is someone who wants to be in the details, in the weeds, and I'm just wanting to leap. And so I'm very strategic. She's very, fact-based and, focused on the details of things. And it's helped kind of really explain our dynamic as a couple, but also the dynamic of my entire team here. There's 8 people at Vertical Motion now, and we all understand each other's traits. We understand, well, that's your trailblazer coming out, right? And, that's your debater. Okay. So maybe give a little bit of sense of, like, I'm mentioning these names or these labels that people get. Maybe talk a little bit about those labels and what that all means.
Yeah. So what you just outlined is we essentially have what we call 19 typified patterns, right? And generally people fit into those 19 patterns. There's some variations. There's some people who are kind of hybrids, right? But generally speaking, people are going to fall into one of those 19 patterns. And I tell people, if you've been doing this for as long as I have, when I literally do not have to survey anyone anymore, I could walk into a room, talk to someone, sometimes just see them because of their mannerisms and know how they're wired, right? Because people are truly that predictable. But what you're talking about is when you understand how people are designed, you understand where they fit. And that's the biggest thing that we do at Culture in this, is show people not only all about the individual, but all about the organization and how you build cohesive teams. Some people, as you mentioned, they're way more macro. Some people are way more tactical. And oftentimes there are certain patterns that we call integrators that tie it all together. And when you generally look at organizations and really effective teams, they have the right balance, enough offense to continue to grow top line, enough defense to manage that bottom line, and enough integrators to tie everything together so that that team runs efficiently. So really, that's the beauty of it all, is to not only appreciate, how to utilize the data tactically, but how you can use it from a macro perspective to understand the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and gaps, so that you are able to scale teams and organizations effectively.
It helps a lot too, to say what you just said, that it takes, the best, most effective teams have a little bit of everything in them, right?
Right.
They have the gas, they have the brake, but they also have the glue that holds those two together, because sometimes gas and brake can't talk to each other without someone in between.
That's exactly right.
Right. And it makes me reflect back on my first startup, and I think about the people that I biased towards hiring were like me. And so
100%.
I was hiring dozens of highly strategic, aggressive go-getters. And when you put that many types of like daredevils and, trailblazers,
Yeah.
you put rainmakers, you put them all in one room, they're going to eat each other alive, which is exactly the culture that I wound up creating. And in retrospect, I learned some hard lessons, and now I have like quantitative understanding of why that culture became so caustic, because every single person was good natured and very driven, and but just when we were all together, 40 or 50 of us in a room, it got aggressive. So
Right. Oftentimes we call that managing healthy conflict. You know what I mean? Because those are a bunch of big picture, big ego conflict patterns. You know what I mean? So the way to often run organizations like that is to find a little bit more balance, and it also takes a really strong leader with a strong understanding of the different personalities to hold it all together. Right? And it can be tough.
I think you'd shared before that like there are certain patterns that are better suited for certain roles. Someone might be an architect, might be a great COO. A philosopher might be a great CTO, right?
Right.
Rainmaker would be a good CRO. The question I want to ask is, if you show up as a certain pattern, does that mean that you cannot be a different role? Like the question that I get a lot is, if I'm a traditionalist or if I'm a craftsman, if I'm down here in the weeds, can I still be CEO someday?
That's a really good question. And the answer is absolutely. Yeah. I literally have craftsman CEOs. You know what I mean? But here's what matters. Are you coachable and are you self-aware? In other words, do you understand where you fit? And do you understand that you are a more tactical individual as a craftsman? And that comes from self-awareness. And believe me, the best craftsman CEOs I work with understand that they are very tactical, very analytical, very detailed type people. But in general, they are by and large risk averse humans. And to grow a business, that can be tough if you don't partner up with someone like me and you. And ultimately, just like on the flip side, people like me and you can run an organization off the rails because we don't have that very tactical, detailed execution type guy by our side. So what I always tell people is, just if you think about it, we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. And if you're aware of what your strengths are, and with that understand that the most effective executives find the person who balances them. So, and that's where we get the whole visionary integrator concept from. So if you're more of a visionary, you get yourself an integrator. If you're more of an integrator, partner up with a visionary. And believe me, all the organizations I work with, I can see almost instantly the ones who are going to be incredibly effective because they have a strong visionary integrator combo. And that's at the top, but the same premise holds true oftentimes throughout the organization for all their leaders. And if you think about it, me and you came from the Army, like theoretically, that's why you have platoon leaders and platoon sergeants and company commanders and, first sergeants and battalion commanders and sergeant majors. Ideally, that's a 1-2 visionary integrator punch, strategic and tactical.
Yeah, one of the clients in my mastermind, he is the number 2 in a 400-person contracting shop in Korea. The number 1 is very much a visionary, and he is I think he's a craftsman. Oh no, wait a minute, scholar. He's a scholar, which is also more on the down in the weeds side. But he's kind of like, I'm here to kind of support everything and make sure everything stays on the rails, and he loves that role. That's actually his joy, is being the one who implements things on the inside, while the visionary leader, he's the one that wants to go out, meet with the locals, and have go to all the events around Asia Pac and all of that.
Yeah, and again, just because your title is CEO doesn't mean that you're the visionary. There's a difference between org charts and accountability charts. So you could be the CEO, but you're president. You could be the CEO, but you may be more the integrator, and your president may be more the visionary. You know what I mean? So it's just figuring that out. And again, that just comes from the best leaders I work with are incredibly coachable, open to ideas, and very, very self-aware of what their strengths and weaknesses are.
Yeah, that's a big thing. That's the important part, is the self-awareness. So you work with some pretty great organizations and great companies, and you've had some really amazing success stories with some of them. Can you give examples of how this process that you take clients through has helped some of your client companies?
Yeah, well, it starts with that visionary integrator combo because, I work with a lot of high growth companies, and some of them are relatively early stage. Maybe they're 3, 4, 5 million in revenue. Someone like me and you can literally drag a company, sometimes 10 million plus, but ultimately you're going to hit a plateau, and you're going to need systems and process. So, and a lot of times, as you actually articulated, like a lot of visionaries get in a room with another visionary. It's like, I'm going to bring this guy on to be my number two. And now you have two people who think alike, and both of them are big idea guys who really can't execute. And that happens so much. And then they can't figure out why they can't build the system process to scale. So oftentimes that's one of the first challenges that I see is that they don't have that 1-2 punch, driving the organization from the top. And then, like I said, the same theory holds true where a lot of my companies, when they start out, they have a very tactical team of specialists who just are task focused and execute. And they have the big patterns in like the VP of sales and the COO and sometimes the CTO. And what often happens is that organization has the gas and it has the brake, but the CEOs articulate to me, like, I feel like I'm having to reach too far down. My team's having to stretch too far up. So they may get close sometimes, but there's always a divide. And that's oftentimes where I show them it's because you don't have enough of the right integrators in the middle of the organization. I explain that by telling people, like, certain people are 5,000 foot patterns, certain people are 50,000 foot patterns like you. The integrator is an interesting human because oftentimes we call them architects and tech experts, but they have the high A, the strategic, the gas, and they have the high D, the tactical, the defense. And that type of individual can zoom all the way out and zoom all the way in. So when the big visionary like you articulates their vision, they instantly get it. They look out 5 years, they backwards plan, they create the process. And because they understand everyone down here as well as they understand you, they essentially can now translate and then manage that process. And that's how you tie organizations together. So like when we talk about the organizations I work with, it's typically that, sometimes it's like, okay, you don't have enough gas, you don't have maybe enough brake, but oftentimes it's the hole in the middle that's not allowing the organization to properly tie together, glue together, like you said, and scale.
And I will tell you in transparency here, we are missing an integrator in our organization here at Vertical Motion. We have several detail-oriented people, 4 of them, and then we have 4 very strategic people. And I guess one is a debater. And so she kind of acts as an integrator, but
yeah, on the cultural side, the people side, no doubt.
On the people side, right? So I'm missing that operations person, that side person. And that's something that, I've thought a lot about. How do I fill that gap? And I don't know if I found the right person yet for that.
Yeah, every single time I find a CEO, that pure integrator, 6-7 months later, they call me up and tell me I changed their life because I freed them back up to be a visionary. I allowed them to get on the business instead of in the business. Because if you're a visionary and you have to get down in the details, something has to give. What happens is our A trait, that macro autonomy, the thing that allows us to see the big picture, that trait drops.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially our vision becomes clouded. And we often are the ones who drive that organization forward. And without us being able to see the big picture, the organization does not move forward as well. So getting that big visionary back in their zone of genius on top of the business instantly frees them, is what I say. And now they can finally know that they have someone who they can essentially delegate and trust to execute that vision. And that's a game changer.
It is. And I can feel the absence of that myself. Today, I spent, 6 hours being very strategic, high level planning for 2025, trying to understand what are the things that people should be working on. And it took me more time to get into that frame of mind than it usually does because I have been in the business, making the content, making this, making that, working in a CRM. I should not be integrating a CRM. And that's what I'm doing right now.
Yes.
I'm messing with spreadsheets and webhooks and it's like, no, this is not, and obviously as entrepreneurs, we do what we have to do, but it does take away my ability to think strategically. And so I did that for several hours and actually had to take a nap. I was so exhausted from stretching myself back into, this bigger strategic mindset. And now I'm back into doing the detailed stuff. So like, I love when you do have that connection with someone who is your opposite or is the complement, I think is a better way to say it, right? Is that probably the most compelling and powerful thing that you do for your clients is help put the right people in the right seats by making sure that their personality matches the role, right? Is that that's the secret sauce?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We say, right seats. seats. So making sure that individuals right seats. And just like I was hired because I fit the ideal pattern. And that's one of the big things we do as an organization is you do essentially an organization audit. And as a leadership team, anyone who's involved in the hiring, managing, leading of certain roles, we use the process called a C job process. And I mean, part of that process is to look at the organization and the people currently in those seats. For example, it was like one of the companies I just started working with, to give you an idea, it's a Wall Street trading firm, and they have 29 traders who are essentially all sales guys, and the CEO told me his biggest problem, he's just missing too much. He hires a lot of veterans, so he just thought if you were a veteran that you would have what it takes to be in that role. Bad assumption. But when we looked at that organization and assessed those 29 people, like before he told me, I said, I'll tell you who your top 5 guys are right now. And I saw Daredevil, Rainmaker, and 3 Trailblazers. And I was like, these are your top 5 guys. And he said, those are my top 5 guys.
And those are the very strategic. Those are the very strategic personalities.
Big risk taker.
Yeah.
So we don't take no for an answer. It doesn't hurt us. I mean, that's why we're born, to kind of be hunter sales, and only certain people are kind of wired that way. But there's certain people who are kind of like maybe like have some of the traits. So they're B, and there's certain people who are just absolutely in the wrong seat. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Now we understand that. And of course, we got input from all the leaders through the C job process, which is one part survey through the lens of what traits do you believe individuals need to have to be successful in the role, which also is a tool that we use to make sure that everyone who's hiring is aligned. When they each take that, it could be like you want to make sure that generally everyone's coming back with the same idea and the same traits. But when we marry those two up, we create that ideal pattern. And, once we have that pattern, we focus on hiring people who have the inherent traits. So essentially, anyone who applies, we stack rank them from 0 to 100. And ideally, we're looking for people who are a 70% or better match. So we know they have roughly 3 out of the 4 inherent traits to be successful in that role. And as you can imagine, you're increasing your odds of success because now you're hiring people designed to do that, like me, who had no experience. And naturally, because it's more of a natural fit, it's easier for us to figure out. Which organizations, it's all about productivity. So the quicker we can get the individual productive, the better. And if someone's designed to do the role, it doesn't take as long for them to become ramped up. You know what I mean? So we use that process, like I said, throughout the organization. And that helps us too with succession planning, because now we can look at throughout the organization, especially when we have leadership roles. Well, who else downstream is designed, for some of these leadership roles? Now, as an organization, maybe that doesn't have all the resources, we can focus our resources, time and money, cultivating the people designed so we don't always have to go outside to hire future leaders. We can invest in the ones who are kind of designed to do that. And it helps us right seat because we can look across the organization. I can't tell you how many times someone is in the wrong seat, but you have a right seat because you went through that exercise, and we move them over and they flourish. And they were about to get fired. You know what I mean? So I actually love when that happens.
Yeah, I use the analogy of some people, every person is a flower and every culture is a soil. And if you put the wrong flower in the wrong soil, it's going to kill it, right? What works for a cactus will not work for a daffodil, right? And so you are putting the people in the right seats. You're figuring out, based on these analytics, who you are, your traits, your innate traits, your core personality, and how you perceive the world, how you see the world. All of that goes into helping understand you should be in these kinds of roles. You should be doing this kind of work. You should be responsible for this level of detail or strategy, right? And so it leads to your point, organizations having the right team, and that leads to tremendous business success, because when people are happy, they trust each other more, and business runs at the speed of trust, right? The ability to have a great team that can lean into each other and work in their zone of genius, each of them, that's a team that will go to the moon if you want it to.
Right. And as you know, like Jim Collins, Good to Great, the great organizations have engagement rates 50% more, the really great ones 70%, and it's much easier to see why, because they're getting all the right people in the right seats. And that's one of the biggest things we do, because on average, I often cite the Gallup State of the Workforce survey that says that, across the globe, roughly only 21% of individuals are fully engaged. And when you ask people the question, like, are you in a role that you feel you're great at and you love, only 13% of the population even say. Now, then another, I think 11% say something along the lines they're in a role that they like and they feel like they're great at it. Think about how many people are not. And I always say, now think about the 80-20 rule. why do you think 20% of the people are responsible for 80% of your productivity? It's because of that.
Because only
You know what I
20%
mean?
in the right seat, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Because of that.
Wow. Dean, this is fascinating stuff. I always feel like I learn something every time I talk with you. Let me ask you this. Just as a last question before we wrap up. I ask this question of everyone that I interview. What does good leadership look like to you?
It's a great question. I tell you, first we'll start out what bad leadership looks like.
Okay.
So bad leadership is your leadership style is one size fits all. This is who I am. Everyone needs to adapt to me. I mean, I literally had a couple leaders like that in the military, and they were the worst leaders I ever worked for. I always tell people that the greatest leaders understand how to meet people where they're at. And we often talk about the golden rule, which is still important, treat me how I want to be treated. But the bottom line is like the platinum rule is to truly understand how to treat people how they want to be treated.
Hmm.
And, the best leaders I have, they use analytics to understand how each one of their people are uniquely wired, how best to motivate, how best to communicate, what they need to do to create an environment for them to be successful. But here's the thing. This is the biggest challenge for all people who want to be leaders. We do have a core. And for us to meet people where they are, we have to modify our behavior. And modifying our behavior drains essentially our battery. So it's not easy to be a leader because you do have to expend a lot of energy to shift your behaviors to meet people where they're at. But if you want to be a good leader, that's what you have to do. So when I say the best leaders that I work for, it's because they really take the time to look at their people, using the data, understand how to get them in the right seats, and then understand what they need to do to create that environment and use the proper motivators to really get those people to excel and thrive.
Dean, you've been around a lot of leaders, you've seen a lot of leadership styles over the years, and I really appreciate your context there. That's actually very valuable. So that's something I'm taking away from all of this conversation is how you define leadership and what really is important. So, well, Dean, thank you. This was a fantastic conversation. If the audience is interested in learning more about what you do or how they might even have a chance to work with you or learn more about how this all works, where should they find you?
Yeah, so one of the easiest things to do is to go right to the Culture Index website and request a team diagnostic with the caveat to please put my name so you don't just go to some random advisor. It's a Dean Bundschu. But yeah, anyone who's interested, here's the thing. Data, showing people how this works is the most important thing we do. We don't just walk in and sell you on what we do. We show you what we do. And the way we show you is to do a team diagnostic. And that team diagnostic is part of our process, and there's no commitment. So I don't know why most organizational leaders wouldn't want to do that, because it gives us the opportunity to assess your team and then gives me the opportunity to share with those leaders the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and gaps, and shows the power of the data, because seeing is believing. And oftentimes when organizations understand that, I don't see how I can continue to run this team without that. So needless to say, I tell people if they want to learn more, understand, get some true hard data insights on their team, that's the best way to do it.
So if you're interested in understanding more about Culture Index, more about what Dean does, you want to have a conversation with Dean, I'll put your LinkedIn profile down in the description
Which
of
is
this
another
video.
great way. Yep, just reach out straight on LinkedIn too. So,
And then also the link to Culture Index to the survey so that they can reach out by asking questions about themselves and learn a little bit about themselves, and then maybe have a conversation with you about working together, helping make their organization better. And I want to thank you for all the help you've given to me and the 150 people in my community who have also taken Culture Index assessments and now understand themselves and why they interact with people a certain way. It's really a fascinating thing that you do, and I appreciate what you do, Dean.
yep, I appreciate having the opportunity today, and I've loved seeing how far you've come in such a short period of time. Because if you remember, when you told me you were going to become an entrepreneur, I was like, dude, you're born to do that. And so I'm not surprised at what you've built in such a short period of time, man.
That's back when I didn't have hair. Well, Dean, thanks so much for being here this evening. I really appreciate your time. And if you guys have any questions about Culture Index, you can reach out to Dean from the links down below. And if you want to learn more about how vertical motion helps people take the next step in their executive career, there's a link for that as well. So with that, I'll see you all in the next one.